Welcome back to Connect and Transform. In today's video, we're beginning creating a text comparison tool for the web. I have a rough idea of how I want it to work eventually, but I have no idea, like algorithm-wise, how I'm actually going to handle different scenarios for the text comparison. I think for today's video, I'll be happy if we just get the boilerplate out of the way, and if we maybe get the first rule set started, which would be a direct comparison from the left to right-hand side when those two lines are exactly equal, and then show that with some kind of like a green background or something to that effect. But the idea is, like, eventually there might be drag and drop regions on the left and right where you're dragging your two files onto the browser and then it automatically compares them. There'll probably be some other buttons and stuff, but for now there's just going to be two file upload elements, and then uploading the second file will trigger the comparison, and the comparison is just going to generate a set of divs. Basically, it's going to look like a two-column table. There's just going to be some divs on the left, divs on the right, holding the text value, the value of the line of text that it's comparing, and then probably also specifying, at least temporarily, which rule was used to allow that line to be created, because eventually we're going to have a few different rules, and if they're not working right or if we need to adjust one, I want a quick way of being able to drill down into the code. So let's get started with largely boilerplate stuff. So we're going to have an HTML tag. We're going to have some CSS, so that'll be a style tag. And for good measure, type equals text dash slash CSS. We'll get back to that in a moment. So now we've got to add our two file upload elements, which will be input elements. We'll give them an ID, and their type will be file. So the ID would be file right and file left. And then we also want to just add a container. So div with a closing tag, and the ID here can just be container. And the idea is that this is a singular container. There will be two sub-containers inside of this for the left and the right, and then inside the left and right will be individual containers for all the various lines, and all that stuff will be created probably in JavaScript. Doesn't necessarily have to be. I could create the two sub-containers here in HTML. But let's add our script tag. So script type equals application slash JavaScript, just for good measure, and then a closing tag. Okay, so let's look at our CSS real quick. Let's add a rule that will target everything. So I'm going to use a similar line, or maybe exactly the same line as I've used in previous projects. I'm going to set a default font family. We're going to have three. We're going to have a default and then two fallbacks. So our default will be Helvetica. I can never remember that name. And then it'll fall back to Verdana, which falls back to Arial. We'll have a default font size of 17 pixels, a default line height matching the font size, 17 pixels. And then we're going to strip away all margin and all border from all elements. I mean all padding. So margin and padding, we'll add it back if we need to. And then for our sub containers, so we'll just say dot sub container. So that's what we'll commit to calling that class name. So that'll be our vertical container on the left and our vertical container on the right. So those will each be 50% of the screen width, 100% of the height. And they're going to be displayed as inline block. Okay, so the width is 50%, height 100%. And then the right subcontainer specifically will float to the right. And so we'll have to remember when we create that one to give it both of these class names so that that rule actually matches. And then in each of our subcontainers, we'll have lines of text. So we'll just say that we have a class name called .line. And we're going to say that the height of that, which is probably going to be a div, we're going to match that to our default font size and our default line height to be 17 pixels. And then we're going to give it some borders to separate it from the other cells, so that if we have a group that all has the same background color, we want to be able to see very clearly that it is more of a grid and that the lines are separated. So we're going to have border bottom, 1 pixel solid, and we'll make it some gray color. And then border left, again, 1 pixel solid, and we'll make it a gray color. I might make this one a little bit darker, just so that the vertical separator between the left and the right is just a little bit more pronounced. And then we also want to have overflow hidden. So if your window is really small or your line of text is really long, it's not going to bleed out into other lines. And I'll have to think about how I handle long lines in the UI later, but for now we're just going to hide the overflow. And then let's say that within .line, maybe we're classifying it in some way to set background color and or color. So let's say we have an exact match. Yeah, so maybe I'll call that .line.exact. And so we're going to set a background color, which will probably be a very light shade of green. And then we may also want to, let's see, I'm mixing up my languages here. So the color and the background color. Okay, so each of these is going to be defined as RGBA, red, green, blue, and alpha channel. So our background color, if we get an exact match, let's say we want it to be really light green. So green, in this case, red will be 0, blue will be 0, green will be, red, green, blue. So red will be 0, green will be 255, blue will be 0, and then our alpha channel, maybe we say 10% opaque, so 0.1. And then for our color, that'll probably be black, 0, 0, 0. And then for the alpha channel, maybe we'll just say 0.5. And so the reason for that is that if you have an exact match, you don't need to pay as much attention to it. So I want the color, which is going to default to black, or well, in this case, we're defining it as black also, but the browser default is black as well. I want that to be more subtle. So that's why I'm making it half transparent. Okay, so what else might we have? Well, we're going to show the rule set that allowed the line to be created. So I'm going to call that .rule, and we might remove this later, but for now, I'm going to make it a smaller font, and I'm also going to say font style italic. Okay, and that, well, maybe also I'll make it even more subtle like that with some opacity. I'm also thinking that when we show tabs, I want to kind of follow what Notepad++ does and show an arrow character. So we might style tabs specially. And so this might be opacity 0.3, let's say, and then I'll duplicate that line. At some point, we're going to have to target actual text content. So this is not a text element. This is a text class name that'll be inside of a div. But I'm not sure how we might want to style that. So for now, I'm just going to say opacity 1. Maybe I won't even say anything. I'll just leave it there so that I know it's going to exist when we create it, but I don't think we need any special styling. So I think now we're on to the JavaScript stuff. So we have two input elements. So we know we're going to have file contents for the left and right. So file contents left, and we'll initialize that to be empty. Same for the right. Okay, we might need to target these elements here. I'll call that file input left. And so that'll be document dot query selector given ID file left. We'll duplicate that, do the same thing for the right. This, as with every day, this is not my day for typing. And even there, as I say that, 2 G's, okay. So all that just to get references to our input elements. Then we need to add some event handlers that are going to say when a file is uploaded here, we want to run some handler. And that handler will check to see if both files have been uploaded. Once they've both been uploaded, then it will call the actual function that does the comparison. So we've got our element here. So we'll say dot on change. And that will trigger some function. And we're going to have to create this function. And we want to pass the event into that function. So we'll call this load file. And we're going to pass the event in. Let's duplicate this line. And then we also want to track whether it's left or right, so that we know which bucket to put the contents into. And I could have used true, false, 0, 1, whatever, it doesn't really matter. We just need some distinguisher here. In fact, I could have just had some iterator completely outside the function. But now we need to define this load file function, which takes an event and a side. Okay, so here we're going to define our file and a file reader. So that is going to be event.target.files at position 0. And this is going to be a new file reader. And then we're going to say reader.readAsText file, and that's what's going to trigger loading the reader. So then we're going to say reader.onload equals function and then inside this we're going to have an if else. And so this is going to be if side is left, then we're going to initialize the left file contents. So that will equal reader.result. Otherwise, file contents right will equal reader.result. And then we're going to say if they've both been uploaded, so if file contents left dot length is not false and file contents right dot length is not false. then we're going to call our actual function, text compare. And so this is the one that's going to do all the heavy lifting for us. Okay, so the first thing, well, yeah, I could put this in either function, I guess, but the first thing we're going to do is we're going to hide the file inputs. So file input left.style.display equals none. Let's duplicate that and do the same thing for the right. Okay, let me just save this here and let's do a quick demo. Let me refresh. So we've got our two file inputs. Let's say that I choose this one and I choose this one. Oh yeah, and so that's all we've done so far is we've hidden these two. So we haven't gotten around to creating our actual containers. So let's do that. So this will be subcontainer left equals document dot create element. We're creating a div. And then we're going to set a few attributes. So we're going to set a class name and we're going to set an ID. So for the ID, we're just going to call it subcontainer left, same as our variable here. For our class name, let's look at what we chose here. We chose subcontainer, and then I also want to give it a class name of left. And then we're going to append it. So that would be document dot query selector container append child, and then it will be our subcontainer. And then I'm going to copy this entire block and do the same thing for the right. Okay. So now we've got our two subcontainers created. Let me save. I'm going to hit F12 here. I'm going to refresh. Right, so right now we only see container in the DOM, so let me upload a couple of files here. I'm going to upload graph and the other version of the graphs. Okay, let's open up container. Okay, so now we see our two containers, subcontainer left, subcontainer right. And you can see there in blue that they're taking up half the screen each. Okay, so now let's continue our text compare by actually splitting out the contents by lines and then building the objects that we'll use later on in the function to actually evaluate what to show. So we're going to say left file lines equals, and that's from our file contents. We're going to split them. On the new line character, let's duplicate that and do the same thing for right. Okay, so now we've got our lines as an array. And now we're going to create a couple new variables very similar to the lines arrays, except we're going to hold a few more things together in one array of objects, one bundle of objects. And so basically here, all we're doing is we're going to be pushing some data onto a bundled array. So here we're going to push an object. That object is going to have an ID, which we'll get back to. We'll have content, which will be equal to the item held in left file lines. And then we're also going to have display specific content, which might be different than the content itself. In fact, it will be, because we're going to have to escape opening brackets, and we're going to have to, we're going to choose to modify tab characters with Unicode arrows. So for here, let's say our iterator will be L. So L equals 0. We're going to increment L, and L is going to be less than left file lines dot length. So basically, for every item in this array, we're going to build this object out. And so our content is just going to be that. Our display content is going to be similar to that, except that we're going to customize it. So we'll say dot replace all for the display content, and we're going to replace all tab characters with a special Unicode character, which I'm going to copy from this website here. And I'll paste it in right there. Okay, and so we're replacing all tab characters with that fancy arrow. And then we're also going to replace opening braces with that, okay? And then we need to set our ID, which will just be L. Now we're going to copy this block and do the same thing for the right. I promise we're almost through this kind of setup stuff. Okay, right. So right file lines, right file line objects, lines. Okay, so this stays the same. Oh, I misspelled this, didn't I? As always. But I spelled it correctly there. Okay. So right, left, and then just for good measure, I'm going to change the iterator here to be R. I probably should have just made it I for both. Okay, so now these two objects, the file line object, those are the ones that we're actually going to use in our function. Now, as I was mentioning in the past video, we're going to have like a minimum of 4 pointers that I know of. So let's get those on the board here. So we're going to have left processing pointer. We'll initialize it to 0. Let's duplicate that. Same thing for right. And then we're going to have a look ahead, or maybe we'll call it a discovery pointer. And discovery pointer. Okay, and then we're also going to have, as I mentioned in the last video, we'd probably need some way to keep track of line numbers separate from the file line numbers on either side. So I'm going to call that line iterator. We can just initialize that to 0 as well. Okay, so now we get into our actual loop that actually does something. And we want to do something until our processing pointers are done. So I'm going to say while processing pointer is less than, now I suppose I could use the length of this, or I could use the length of this. The length is the same either way, but since we're constructing these objects for use in this function, I'm going to choose that one. Oh, and one thing to note is we want to get our rights and our lefts. So we want the left processing pointer to be less than the left file line object length, and the right processing pointer to be less than the right file line objects dot length. Okay, so in our while loop here, now this is where we're going to have rule number 1. So if they're exactly the same, we're going to create some objects. So how do we define they're the same? That would be if the content at left file line objects position, and this is going to be the left processing pointer. So if that left-hand side content, so dot content, is equal to the right side objects at position right processing pointer dot content. So if that's true, then we're going to create some objects. I'm going to copy this div creator here. Maybe it'll save 30 seconds, maybe not. So we're going to be creating basically one div on the left side and then one div on the right side. And then we'll advance all of our pointers. In fact, I'm going to remind myself that after we create the line items, I want to advance the line iterator, and then we also want to advance all of our pointers. So left processing, and then we also want to advance every other pointer, because we don't want to have our discovery pointers lag behind the processing pointers. And because we're saying it's a match and we're creating a cell on both sides, we're essentially consuming a line item from both file A and file B on the left and right side. So that is why we are iterating pointers on both sides rather than just one. Okay, so we are going to be creating a div, and we're going to call this one left line. And we'll give it an ID just for good measure. I don't think it's very important that we do. And then we're going to append this to the left sub-container, which we'll put there. For class name, we'll say line left, and we're saying this is the condition where they're the same. So I'll give it 3 class names. And then for the ID, I'll just say left underscore, and then we'll throw the line iterator in there. So there's only one thing left to do for this left-hand side, and that is to add some content. So we'll say inner HTML equals something, and I think we're going to have a special formatting function for this. What should we call it, though? I'll just call it build content. And we'll pass in our rule, and we'll pass in the actual content. So I guess that'll just be a string for now. So we'll say something like rule 1, and then leave some space. And then for our actual content, that will be, because we're doing the left-hand side right now, that'll be left file line objects at position left processing pointer dot display content. So now we need to go build this function, and then we need to duplicate that creation of the left line to create the right line. So this took a rule and some content, and we're going to be returning a string. So for the rule, we're probably going to wrap that in some kind of a span. So we'll use this rule class here. So we'll say class equals rule. And then I think we're gonna replace spaces with non-breaking spaces. But I think it would be nice to do that in this function so we don't have to remember to do that elsewhere. And then we'll close that span tag. And then we'll have another span tag. And that will be for our text. Remember, we have this text class name up here, and then we'll have to use our tab class name as well. So let's make sure to close that span. And then this will be the content that we passed in. And then we're going to replace, again, just for good measure, we're going to do non-breaking spaces. And then we're also going to implement the tab class. So we previously replaced tabs with arrows. Where was that we did that? Right here. So I'm going to copy that. So we're going to replace any tab instance with an entire span tag. Class equals tab. And then I guess we can just paste that arrow in as the content. There won't be any special content. Let's see, I think that might be it. Let me just kind of move over here. Yeah, okay, and we closed that span. Okay, so I think we're done with build content. So I think the only thing left before we do a demo is copy that and do the right line. So right line, right line, right line, right line. We'll change this to right underscore. Class, we'll change this one to right. It's still rule 1. Right. And right. And I think that will do it. Let me save. Let's see how many typos we got. None yet, but we haven't actually triggered the function yet. So we'll select our 2 files. Okay, so there is some problem. Oh, because right here, I forgot to update this to right. Okay, so we'll refresh. Let's reselect our 2 files. Okay, so there we go. It doesn't look like they're getting our green color. Let's take a look at that. So red, green, blue. Oh, okay, I called that exact match there. So let's match that class name. Okay, so we'll select our files again. There we go. That looks like what I expected. So in this case, everything is a little bit subdued. The text is subdued, the background is subdued, the tabs are showing as arrows. We're showing which rule triggered this exact match. And in this case, because in one of these files there was a line that doesn't exist in the other one, then even if there are lines that are essentially a match, they're all offset from each other. So for rule 1, this is it. This is all we're matching in rule 1. And that's expected. So we'll finish this out in a future video, but we've got the basic structure and flow working. So thank you for watching.